everyone. Today I'm going to be doing a rather brief but semi-comprehensive TEAS review for the science section of the TEAS test. And of course this is a nursing-based entry exam. So what we're going to do is just again cover some of the high points. This is not going to be 100% comprehensive. It really is, as far as the whole entire science section goes, it's going to be rather brief. We're just going to hit the high points and really give you stuff to study. Okay, let me give you an idea of what this really encompasses, the science section. I've got some information here. Scientific reasoning is going to be part of it. Human body science is going to be part of it. Human body science is going to be really the heavy anatomy part. Life science and earth science, okay, / physical science. So those are sections of the science portion. Of course, there's a reading portion, there's an English portion, there's a math portion. I'm not going to cover those. That's not my area. We're just going to focus strictly on science. Now, one thing I should say about this TEAS test, yes, is a tough test, but it's really meant to be a test that really tests what you know really throughout high school. It really is based on that. It's not really a college level test. It sure seems like it because it's hard. Probably the one area that is the toughest is the science part, because there is stuff that students haven't had in high school and they've only had in college. So I will just kind of throw that out there to you, but it's something that a lot of students can take and actually do well on right out of high school. So just keep that in mind. The sections really that we're going to go over pretty quickly, just to kind of give you a heads up, is going to be anatomy, just general anatomy and physiology overview, circulatory system, respiratory, nervous, digestive, a little bit on immune, a little bit on reproductive, and then a little bit on terminology as well. We're also going to do a little bit on the chemistry side of things. Okay, so real quick, just some basic things to know. What is anatomy and what is physiology? You take anatomy, take it with physiology. So anatomy is the study of the structure of the body. Physiology is going to be the study of function. So some basic stuff there. One of the things you're going to be need to be familiar with is just the hierarchy of your anatomical system. So where do we start? What's going to be the quote-unquote simplest part of our body? Well, that's really going to start with the atom. Okay, and yes, you could go smaller than the atom because you could get into the subatomic particles, and we were going to mention some of those here shortly. But as far as the hierarchy goes, we're going to say the simplest is going to be the atom. Then where are we going to go from there? Well, we're going to go to a molecule. Then we're going to go to macromolecules, which are basically just large molecules. Then where we're going to go? We're going to go to organelles, and then to cells. Okay, so obviously the organelle is going to be the individual parts, internal working parts of the cell. And then what's the cell? That's our basic functional unit of life. Okay, so that is an important thing to understand. From the cell, what do we get? We get tissues, we get organs, and then we get organ systems, which would be like digestive system, reproductive system, respiratory system, what have you. And then, of course, what do we have after that? We have the organism, which is the human body as a whole. So we want to understand that hierarchy. I'm not going to write everything down. This is going to be a lot of verbal. Yes, we are going to write some important things down. Also refer you to some of my other videos if we have a video on certain topics. Okay, but levels of organization or hierarchy, very important to know for the TEAS test. Next thing we're going to talk about real fast, we can go ahead and write this down, is going to be the 4 tissue types of the body. Very important. So we've got epithelium, we've got nervous tissue, we've got muscular tissue, and we've got connective tissue. Okay. So there are the 4 tissues of the body. Every tissue is going to fall under one of these categories. Now, we have a lot of subtypes when it comes to each of these tissue types. We really don't have time to go into all the quote-unquote subtypes, but that's something for you to review the 4 tissues of the body. Okay, when we're talking about epithelium, we're really talking about two major subcategories, and we can go ahead and put those down. They're either going to be simple or they're going to be stratified. Simple simply means it's going to be one layer of epithelium, one layer of cells, which is obviously going to be a thinner type of epithelium. This is going to be definitely an internal layer of epithelium because, again, it is so thin. Stratified epithelium is going to be multi-layered, okay? Two or more. Usually we see, a lot of times 50 plus layers of cells. Definitely we'll see this internally, but we'll definitely see it externally. Stratified, for instance, stratified squamous epithelium is going to be our skin type. So we would expect a thicker, tougher layer because, again, it's an external layer on the body. So the epithelial layers are either going to fall under simple or stratified, and then there's going to be types of simple and types of stratified. So you want to go back and review those to make sure you're familiar with that. Another thing we'll talk about this here in a little bit, but the nervous tissue, okay, is going to be a type of tissue. Obviously, that's going to involve the central nervous system, the peripheral nervous system. In fact, I can go ahead and give you the two types here. The two types of nervous tissue are either going to be your neurons, okay, or your neuroglia. In case you don't know, the neuron is simply going to be the part of the nerve tissue that sends signals. Because we know the nervous tissue is designed basically for sending signals, right? It's a communication-based tissue. That's what makes it unique. So this neuron is going to send the signals. What do the neuroglia do? There are supportive cells. They support and assist the neuron, okay? So again, we'll talk a little bit more about that. What about muscular tissue? Well, obviously, this is unique again. This is going to be designed for movement. We can go ahead and put the three types of muscle tissue down here. Three types, most of you guys are familiar with this already. It's going to be skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. So these are our three types of muscular tissue. Skeletal is also referred to as somatic muscle, right? When we think of our muscles of our body, most people think of skeletal muscle. This is our voluntary muscle that moves the body voluntarily, right? So this is all of the muscles in our arms and legs, back, chest, neck, feet, what have you. Cardiac muscle is only in the heart, and that's a key thing to remember for the TEAS test. It is only in the heart, okay? Smooth muscle is easy to remember because it's all other organs other than the heart, okay? Now that would include blood vessels. That's a big area of confusion. Blood vessels are made of smooth muscle, okay? We refer to cardiac and smooth also as visceral muscle, which simply refers to the organs. So it's organ-based muscle. So keep that in mind. Last and largest area of the four tissues is connective. Again, I'm not going to go through all the parts of connective. It's quite large. It's everything from fat, okay, to fibrous connective tissue, which has many other subtypes, areolar, reticular. It's things like cartilage. It's things even like blood. Blood is a connective tissue. Another one is bone. Bone is a connective tissue. So this is a very large tissue area. And what does connective do? It does exactly what it says. It connects. Connects, supports, protects. Okay? So again, we can say a little bit more about this down the road. But these are our four tissues. Very important to know. Okay? So another thing I'm going to talk about, also really important, and this is just a good anatomy review as well, and that's going to be on anatomical terms. If you don't know your anatomical terms, it's going to be really tough to do anything in anatomy, understand anything in anatomy. For instance, the term visceral, we could just throw that out. I mentioned that term a minute ago. It refers to the organs, right, or internal organs, okay? Somatic, if you ever see that term, that is a term that simply means body, okay? Usually when you see the term somatic, you're thinking of body structures that are more external in nature. So you could kind of picture these as being opposite, right? If it's visceral, it's going to be more internal, right, dealing with organs. Somatic, it's going to be more external, dealing with external body structures. These are things like muscle, bone. We could even throw cartilage in there. Skin. Things like that, okay? Again, when we're talking about organs, we're talking about anything internal, okay? So some other important terms we can just give you, much of which we'll have you guys review. Anterior and posterior. This just simply refers to the front of the body and the back of the body. Keeping in mind, anytime we're using these directional terms, and we're going to talk about quite a few of them here, we're always going to base it on anatomical position. And of course, anatomical position is when I'm standing erect. Notice my palms are forward. We would consider that the supinated position. Of course, I'm standing with my feet and toes facing forward, my head also facing forward. So we're going to base everything on that. So when I say front of my body or anterior part of my body, okay, I'm talking about what you see here. If I spin around, now you're seeing the posterior part of my body. That would mean the back of my hand is posterior. Palms, anterior, okay? Some other terms, ventral and dorsal on a human, basically mean the same thing as anterior and posterior. Okay, it really would have a different meaning if we're talking about four-legged animals, but as far as human body is concerned, anterior and ventral basically are the same. Posterior and dorsal. So if you see some of these terms, some other terms to review, we'll put it here: superior and inferior, which simply means to top and bottom. Again, important terms to be familiar with. Medial and lateral. Okay. Inner body part, outer body part. Body part, that's going to be closer to the midline. Body part is further from the midline. Very commonly used with extremities. We're using an example of my arm here. This is going to be the medial side of my arm. Notice it's the called the inner part of the arm versus the outer part of the arm, which would be lateral. Right? So think about it this way. My thumb is lateral because in anatomical position, right? Thumb is going to be on the outside. Same with my index finger. It would be lateral. Pinky or fifth digit, that's going to be medial. Okay, so some good terms there. Obviously, ears are lateral, right? Could we call the nose and the mouth medial? Yes, but a better term would be median. Median would mean perfectly midline. Okay, so another term there. Some other terms which deal with closer or further from the midline would be proximal and distal. Closer to the midline, proximal, further away would be distal. Again, could use my arm as an example. Hand is more distal because it's further from the midline of my body, versus I could say, like, for instance, my shoulder is more proximal. It is closer. Okay. Some other good terms here. I'll write this one out. Superficial versus deep. Superficial is simply closer to the surface of the body, like skin. Deep means simply deeper in the body. Muscle is considered deep or deeper, right? Organs would be very deep because they're more internal. So it just simply means closer to the surface. Deep would be further away from the surface of the body. Okay. Some other things to be familiar with too, and write those right over here, would be the planes of the body. We have the sagittal plane. Okay. We have the coronal, I'll use that term. We could also call that the frontal plane. And we also have the transverse. So sagittal plane is going to cut the body in half, giving us a left and a right side. In fact, if it's perfectly centered, we would call it mid-sagittal. Okay? So picture it this way. It's cutting my body like this. So we're going to have, again, a left and a right half. Coronal is going to cut the body in half again, right? It's going to cut it this direction, though. It's going to give me a front and a back, or put it in better terms, anterior, posterior half. Transverse is going to cut the body this direction, giving me a superior and inferior half. So those are imaginary lines we refer to as planes. So be familiar with the three major planes of the body. okay? Okay, so that's a crash course on terminology, on the planes of the body. I will mention one more thing about planes. If it is a physical cut through a body part, could be an organ, whatever. It's a physical cut, we would not call it a plane because a plane's an imaginary line. If it's an actual cut, like we're dissecting something, then we would call these sections, right? So if I had the heart and I did a sagittal cut through the heart, then I would call it a sagittal section. So just to let you know on that, okay? So moving on now, we're gonna get into the organ systems a little bit and have you guys review important parts of the organ systems. And that's really what you need to do. You guys know this, a lot of the review material or literature for the TEAS test is not complete. It's just more or less many of the things I'm giving you. It's what to study. And so I'm giving you important info, but you need to really expand on what I'm talking about. So you need to be confident with it and really spend some time on it. I'd say most students have to spend the most time on the science portion. It tends to have the lowest scores as well. So we're going to go into some of the organ systems. First organ system we're going to talk about real fast is the circulatory system. Obviously, circulatory system is going to be things like the heart, the blood vessels, and blood. Okay, that's a U. Circulatory system. Big thing to know here definitely is things like, arteries versus veins. What does an artery do? Arteries moving blood away from the heart. That is by definition what an artery is. It's not that it's oxygenated or deoxygenated. It is true. Majority of arteries have oxygenated blood, but not all. So you can't really go by that. Veins, majority of veins have deoxygenated blood, right? Minimal oxygen. It's used blood, okay? But by definition, an artery is going to basically move blood away from the heart. Veins are going to move blood back to the heart, okay? So keep that in mind. What about capillaries? Capillaries are the connection between the two. So as blood leaves the arteries, right, or leaves the heart, I should say, through arteries, they're going to get further and further and further away from the heart to more distal areas of the body, and they're going to slowly go into smaller and smaller arteries, leading ultimately into capillaries. What are capillaries going to do? They're going to be our exchange vessels, where oxygen and nutrients are going to be exchanged. It's going to pass through the walls of the capillary to basically oxygenate the tissues of the body. Hormones are going to pass through capillaries. Things like nutrients are going to pass through capillaries. Waste is going to pass through capillaries. Okay, and that includes CO2 as well. Basically, from the capillary, then blood's going to enter through the veins. It's now used blood. Okay, it's oxygen poor or deoxygenated blood. It's headed back to the heart. Another thing to keep in mind. In arteries, we can just mention it here, arteries have a high blood pressure. Veins are going to have a lower blood pressure. So arteries are under high blood pressure. We a lot of times refer to these as resistance vessels. Veins, again, do have a blood pressure. There is still a push of the heart on a vein or inside a vein, but they are going to be lower blood pressure. So what's the pressure in artery? Our average blood pressure is 120/80. Obviously, a lot of people are above and below that. That's the average. Blood pressure in a vein is about 10, right? 10 millimeters of mercury. So that's very, very low compared to the artery. What's interesting about veins, though, is we actually have more blood inside veins at any given time versus an artery. So there's more blood containment in a vein versus an artery. So you can just keep that in mind. Capillaries are going to be the slowest moving areas of blood flow. Why? Because that's where exchange is occurring between again, our oxygen, nutrients, and waste. So keep that in mind. Probably the other really important thing to know in the circulatory system is blood flow through the heart. Super important. Now, you can refer to my other video where we have a separate video on blood flow through the heart. Going to be really important to know that. Paying attention to what valves blood passes through as it goes through the heart. Also paying attention to what's oxygenated and what's deoxygenated. Good rule of thumb is Left side of the heart is oxygenated, right side deoxygenated. So keep that in mind. That's going to be really important. Okay. So then we go into next system, which is intimately a working part, a relationship to the circulatory system. That's our respiratory system. Why is it intimately connected? Well, it's because our blood basically goes from the right side of the heart to the respiratory system, to the lungs. That's where oxygen is infused into the bloodstream. Okay, then it comes back to the left side of the heart and pumped to the entire body. So the two systems, that's why sometimes we call it the cardiopulmonary system, are interconnected. Okay, big thing in the respiratory is, of course, knowing your organs. Respiratory. Okay. Being able to trace the respiratory system, and it's pretty straightforward. Technically, respiratory system is going to start with the nose, right? Yes, the mouth also intakes air as well, but we're going to go, if we start from the very, very top, we go nose, then it go into our mouth and throat. What do we call the throat? Called the pharynx. Then it goes into the voice box, the larynx, then the trachea, right? Then it goes into bronchi. Okay, and then there's different types of bronchi. There's lobar bronchi, there's segmental bronchi. Kind of do some review of that, and then we go into basically bronchioles, which are just really, really tiny passageways. Right? In case you don't know, all these are passageways we're talking about here. We call this the conducting division of the respiratory system. And then basically after bronchioles, and this is what's important, as we go into the alveoli. Okay. So all of the passages or passageways are called the conducting division. And then anything where we have actual gas exchange, again, the major gases we're dealing with again is oxygen and CO2. Anywhere we have gas exchange is going to be referred to as the respiratory division. Now, it's kind of easy to remember this because really everything I just mentioned was passageways except the very last structure, and that was the alveoli. The alveoli are for gas exchange. So really, they're the only major part of the respiratory division. Right? Oxygen basically pushes out through the walls of the alveoli. CO2 pushes in. So basically what are we doing? We're loading oxygen in the lungs. It's going from basically the alveoli into the bloodstream. Right? We call that loading. Right? It's going to be sent to the tissues of the body. What are we doing with CO2 in the lungs? We are unloading it. We're removing it from the bloodstream. It's going into the alveoli, and then we're exhaling. So we're unloading CO2 in the lungs. Okay? So that's a quick and very crash course on the respiratory and circulatory systems. One thing you can also remember about circulatory is what's the major muscle for our respiratory system, I should say? Diaphragm, right? That's our prime mover for respiration. Okay? So moving on, let's go into the nervous again. And I really gave you much of the nervous system, at least, that we're going to talk about. But for the nervous system, if you remember, we mentioned there's two parts to the nervous system, at least two tissues. I'll mention the tissues again. Two tissues was the neuron and the neuroglia. Now, in case you're wondering what the neuroglia, there are 6 types. Again, that'd be a good review to look at the 6 types of neuroglia. Going through and making sure you know what each type does. Again, they are supporting and assisting the neuron. Okay, 4 types are part of the CNS, 4 are part of the PNS. We'll talk about what that means in a minute. Okay. What about the neuron? What in the world is the neuron? We said earlier that is our system for sending signals. The neuron's going to be made of cell body. It's also going to be made of axon, and it's going to be made of dendrites. Those are the 3 major parts of the neuron. Okay. Now, again, that's the tissues of the nervous system. What about the 2 divisions of the nervous system, Well, that's going to be the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Now again, without going into all the details here, you definitely want to review this. It's pretty straightforward as to know what is what. Central nervous system is simply anything inside your brain and spinal cord. Okay? Brain and spinal cord. That is our central nervous system. Peripheral nervous system is going to be anything that is not in the brain and spinal cord. So any branch that comes out of the, let's say, brainstem, we have some cranial nerves that come out of the brainstem, or any branch that comes out of the spinal cord, like for instance, spinal nerves, those are already peripheral nervous system. Okay, so yes, they're coming out of the brain or out of the spinal cord, but they're not inside it. So that would make them peripheral nervous system. So all the nerves in the arms, head, neck, other, lower extremities, nerves of the thoracic cavity, abdominal cavity, wherever, they're all peripheral nervous system. Central nervous system, again, simply brain and spinal cord. So that gives you an idea. This would be the peripheral side would be a larger side. Keeping in mind, though, it's less protected. Okay. Unique thing, and of course, many of you know this already. The peripheral nervous system is capable of regeneration under certain conditions. Meaning, if there's an injury to the peripheral nervous system, it can basically regenerate and be functional again under certain circumstances. The central nervous system is not capable of regeneration. Okay, so if there's an injury to the spinal cord, that injury will quote unquote heal, but heals with scar tissue. Okay, so you're not going to regain function of that that permanently damaged area. Okay. Okay, another system we'll just briefly talk about is the digestive system. Many of you know this is the longest system in the body. If you go from the mouth all the way down to the anus, it's a very, very long system. Probably the most important thing is to review, again, the parts of the digestive system. Where are all the parts? To go back and review. Also review some of the enzymes throughout the digestive system. We first see enzymes in the mouth. So the mouth obviously is the beginning of the digestive system. We have saliva, and in the saliva we have certain enzymes. So it'd be good to review some of those enzymes. Give you a hint, we have enzymes for fat called lipases. Lipase, there's one lipase in saliva. We also have amylase in the saliva, and that's going to be an enzyme to break down carbohydrates. We do not have proteases in the saliva to break down proteins. We'd see our first protease in the stomach. Okay, so from the mouth, obviously, you'd swallow, it would go through the esophagus into the stomach. Again, the stomach would contain the first protease, or basically enzyme to break down proteins. Okay, and that's what enzymes do. They chemically break down, at least as far as the digestive system goes, they chemically break down certain types of categories of foods. So from the stomach, most of you guys know, we go into the small intestine. Got three parts: duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. From there, we go into the large intestine, and then, of course, really what's part of that, the distal part, rectum and anus. So those are our parts. Again, very important to review the digestive system. Also review the things that each part of the system does. For instance, the mouth does digest food, right? What is digestion? Digestion is the breakdown of food. We break it down, obviously, by chewing it. That would be mechanical digestion. We also break it down because there's enzymes, so that'd be chemical breakdown. What does the esophagus do? Basically, it just pushes the food down. The stomach is going to continue to mechanically and chemically break down food. Now, what comes after digestion? Well, after the breakdown of food would come absorption. So in the small intestine, we continue to break down. We continue to digest. There is still further breakdown. There's a lot of digestive enzymes from the pancreas that are secreted into the small intestine. Okay, but after breakdown occurs, and this is what's important, absorption occurs. The majority of absorption is going to be in the small intestine. The duodenum does some, the jejunum does some, the ileum does some. Okay. in addition to breakdown. So that's really important to know. Absorption is heavily accomplished by the small intestine. When we get into the large intestine, we're getting past the absorption stage now. There is some water absorption that occurs in the small or the large intestine, but then we start to compact the waste. Okay, and that's really the large intestine's job. Another thing that a lot of people forget about the large intestine is that's where the majority of the probiotics, or I guess you'd say healthy bacteria, reside in the body. Okay, they reside in the large intestine. We have over 600 species, okay, bacteria in there. So keep that in mind. So then we go from digestive. We'll do a brief discussion on the immune system. One of the tougher systems to understand. Again, what do we want to know about the immune system? Well, the levels of defense. We have first, second, and third. That's important to know. What are the first, second, and third, basically, lines or levels of defense? First line of defense is always going to be considered mechanical barriers. This is things like your skin and your mucous membranes. These are literal external barriers. You know, if there's bacteria, which we know there is in the environment, one of the things that keeps my body free of it is simply my skin, right? And the external barriers. So that's always the first line of defense. Now, obviously, first line of defense does get breached. What becomes then the second line of defense? Second line of defense is still non-specific, okay? In case you don't realize that first is also non-specific. These first two are considered non-specific. The second line of defense is going to be things like fever, inflammation, cytokines, which involve inflammation, those type of responses, which are, I guess you could say, a little more specific, but still in the broad scheme of things, non-specific, okay? So then we go into the third line of defense, which is specific. So then we're dealing with things like white blood cells, specifically cells like lymphocytes, which are a type of white blood cell. We'll go ahead and talk about the types of white blood cells here in a minute, so we're on the same page. And just to give you a rundown so we're all on the same page, inside your blood, we know that we have red blood cells and we have white blood cells, and of course we do have platelets as well. Many of you know platelets are going to be involved in clotting.